In the small, sleepy town of Ashbrook, the air always felt thick with mystery, like something just beneath the surface was waiting to be discovered. The town was filled with quaint little homes, their wooden structures creaking as the wind howled through the trees, and the streets always seemed quieter than they should be for a town of its size. But it was the whispers that always got the town talking, the whispers that spoke of a healer who could cure anything. Her name was Maeve, a woman no one knew much about. She was a phantom to the town, a myth spoken of in hushed voices behind closed doors. Some swore they had seen her, standing at the edge of the woods, cloaked in shadows, while others claimed she lived in a small cottage far from prying eyes. Her age was a mystery. Some said she looked no older than 30, while others swore they had seen her with silver strands woven into her long, dark hair. But no one could deny one thing. Maeve had powers that could heal the sick, mend the broken, and even bring back the dead. For years, the rumors had been swirling, but it wasn't until the arrival of young Emily Marshall that the town began to take notice. Emily had always been a healthy child, full of life, with a laugh that could brighten even the darkest days. But for the last few months, something had changed. She had fallen ill with a mysterious sickness, one that no doctor could explain, and no treatment seemed to work. Her parents had exhausted every avenue, but nothing could cure their daughter's affliction. Desperation hung in the air when Emily's father, Jacob, overheard a conversation at the local tavern. It was there that he first heard the name Maeve spoken with a sense of reverence, like the name itself held a sort of power. "She's the one," the old man had said, leaning in close to Jacob. "The healer. She's the only one who can save her." At first, Jacob had dismissed the idea. A healer? A woman who could cure the impossible? Sounded too fantastical, too absurd. But as Emily's condition worsened, the idea began to take root in his mind. What if Maeve could help his daughter? What if the rumors were true? He couldn't afford to waste any more time. With nothing else left to lose, Jacob made the decision to find Maeve. The journey was not easy. The small village where Maeve was rumored to live was far off the beaten path, nestled deep within the forest. Only a few had ventured there and returned to tell the tale. They spoke of strange things, eerie lights that danced in the trees at night, whispers in the wind, and a sense of being watched by something unseen. No one who had gone to Maeve's cottage ever spoke of what they found there, and those who had returned seemed different. But desperation drives people to do things they might never have considered otherwise. Jacob, holding onto a fragile hope, made his way to the edge of town, where the path into the woods began. He had only a vague description of where the healer's home was supposed to be, but he trusted that he would find it. He had no choice. His daughter's life depended on it. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, the trees more oppressive. The further he walked, the more the world around him seemed to quiet, as if the very forest itself was holding its breath. It wasn't long before Jacob found himself in a small clearing, surrounded by thick, gnarled trees. And there, at the far edge of the clearing, was a small cottage, its windows dark and still. Jacob hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. Was this really the place? Was this where the healer lived? His gut told him that it was, but his mind screamed that he was walking into something far darker than he could comprehend. Taking a deep breath, Jacob approached the door, his hand trembling as he knocked. The door creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Maeve. She was beautiful in an otherworldly way, her features delicate and perfect, almost too perfect. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back like a veil, and her pale skin seemed to glow in the dim light of the cottage. But it wasn't just her appearance that struck Jacob. It was the feeling that washed over him the moment he saw her. It was like the very air around him shifted, like he had stepped into a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. "Come in," Maeve said, her voice soft and melodic, yet with an undertone of something darker, something ancient. "I've been expecting you." Jacob stepped inside, the warmth of the cottage enveloping him. It smelled of herbs and something sweet, almost intoxicating. The inside was simple but elegant. Shelves lined with jars of strange potions and dried flowers, a fire crackling in the hearth, and an old wooden table with a single chair. "Sit," Maeve said, gesturing toward the chair. "Tell me what brings you to me." Jacob swallowed hard, his mind racing as he tried to find the words. "My daughter," he said, his voice breaking. "She's sick. No one can help her. I've heard you can cure anything." Maeve smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was knowing, as if she could see into Jacob's very soul. "Yes," she said softly, her eyes locking onto his. "I can cure anything. But nothing comes without a price." Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He had heard the rumors, the warnings, but he had come this far. His daughter's life was at stake. "I'll do whatever it takes," Jacob said, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, save her." Maeve nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting this response. "Very well," she said. "But remember, all things come with a cost. Be careful what you ask for, because you might not be able to undo it once it's done." Jacob didn't care. He would sacrifice anything, anyone, to save his daughter. Maeve's smile widened, her eyes glinting with something dark, something ancient. "Then you understand." Jacob sat motionless in the chair, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, his heart racing. The cottage felt even warmer now, but there was something unsettling about the atmosphere, something that made him feel like he was sitting at the edge of a precipice. Maeve's eyes never left him as she moved gracefully around the room, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she were preparing for something far bigger than just a simple healing. The fire crackled in the hearth, its orange glow casting long shadows on the walls. Jacob swallowed, trying to calm the fluttering in his chest, but every fiber of his being was screaming that this was wrong. Something was off, but he couldn't stop himself now. He had already come this far. His daughter needed help. He had to trust Maeve. Maeve turned to him, her dark eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I can help her," she said, her voice smooth, like honey, sweet and soothing. "But first, I need you to understand something." Jacob nodded, his throat dry. "I'll do anything," he repeated, almost pleading. "Please, just save Emily." Maeve smiled, but it wasn't the reassuring kind of smile he had hoped for. It was knowing. "Anything you say," she murmured. "Very well. The cost is simple. I heal her, but you must give me something in return. You must give me a part of your soul." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. He blinked, not understanding what she meant. "My soul," he whispered, his voice trembling. Maeve nodded, her expression unwavering. "Yes, it's not an easy thing to give, but it's the only way. The cost is always high, you see. Healing like this isn't free. But I will take only what you are willing to part with." Jacob's mind raced. What did she mean by part of his soul? He had heard rumors about Maeve, about the things she could do, but he never imagined this. He had thought the price would be money, or maybe even his service. But his soul? That was something he couldn't fathom. I don't understand," he stammered. "What do you mean, part of my soul?" Maeve's eyes softened, and she moved closer to him, her presence overwhelming. "It's simple, really," she said. "A part of your life force, a fragment of your essence, something that makes you who you are. It's a small sacrifice, but it's necessary for the magic to work." Jacob's heart hammered in his chest. "What happens to it? To the part you take?" Maeve tilted her head, considering the question. It is used to fuel the magic. It strengthens the healing, ensures that it's permanent. But once it's gone, it's gone. You won't feel the loss at first, but it will linger, like a shadow. And in time, it will catch up to you. Jacob swallowed hard. And if I refuse? Maeve's smile faded, and for the first time, a coldness entered her eyes. Then your daughter dies, she said simply, her voice devoid of emotion. There are no other choices. Jacob's world seemed to tilt. He had come to this place with the hope of saving his daughter, but now he was faced with a choice he never imagined. The price of saving her was steep. More than steep, it was unimaginable. Could he really give up a part of his soul? Could he live with the consequences? But the thought of Emily, pale and weak in her bed, her once bright eyes dull with sickness, pushed aside all doubts. He couldn't let her die. He couldn't lose her. I'll do it, Jacob said, his voice hoarse. Take what you need. Save her. Maeve's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, as though she had been waiting for this moment. She moved toward him, her steps silent on the wooden floor. Very well, she said, her voice almost a whisper now. This will hurt, but it will be quick. Jacob didn't have time to react before Maeve reached out, her cold fingers brushing against his forehead. A sharp, searing pain shot through his body, like a bolt of lightning, and he gasped, his hands gripping the arms of the chair as if he could hold himself together. The pain was unbearable, as though something deep within him was being torn away, something vital and essential to who he was. For what felt like an eternity, Jacob fought to breathe, to remain conscious, but the pain kept coming in waves, each one more intense than the last. He wanted to scream, to beg her to stop, but his voice wouldn't work. All he could do was endure, his body trembling with the force of it. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pain stopped. Jacob slumped in the chair, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. His vision swam, and for a moment, he wondered if he had passed out. But as his senses slowly returned, he felt different, empty somehow, as if a part of him had been taken, and now there was just an aching void where it once was. Maeve stepped back, her expression unreadable. It is done, she said softly. Jacob didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to feel. He had given up a piece of himself, and in exchange, his daughter would be saved. But at what cost? What would happen to him now? To his mind? To his soul? As if reading his thoughts, Maeve spoke again, her voice soft but carrying an undertone of warning. The healing will begin soon. But remember, you cannot undo what has been done. And you may come to regret this decision in ways you cannot yet imagine. Jacob didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. All he could think about was Emily, lying in her bed, waiting for the healing that would save her life. He had done this for her. He had made this choice for her. But as he stood up and turned toward the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had given up a part of himself, and deep down, he knew that this was only the beginning. The night was heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Jacob staggered out of Maeve's cottage, his heart thudding in his chest. The world outside felt different, somehow distant, like he was no longer fully connected to it. He could feel the emptiness in him, the part of himself that was gone, but he couldn't bring himself to understand what it meant. All he knew was that Emily needed him. She needed him to keep moving forward, to make sure she didn't die. As Jacob walked back toward his house, the moon above seemed too bright, casting eerie shadows across the fields. His mind raced, but there was one thought that kept repeating in his head. What have I done? Every step he took felt heavier, and the air around him seemed thicker, almost suffocating. The pain from earlier still lingered in his chest, like a dull ache he couldn't shake. He didn't know what he had given up, but he felt it in every fiber of his being. When he finally reached his house, he found Emily exactly where he had left her. Pale, motionless, and too weak to even lift her head. But there was a change now, a shift. Her shallow breathing seemed steadier. The color in her cheeks was beginning to return. Was this the work of Maeve? Was it happening this quickly? Jacob leaned over his daughter, gently brushing a lock of hair away from her face, his heart swelling with hope. "Emily," he whispered, barely able to breathe. "You're going to be okay." But as he sat there, watching her, something felt off. There was an unsettling stillness in the room, a silence that felt unnatural. The wind outside howled against the windows, but inside, everything was quiet, too quiet. Jacob looked down at Emily again, her face serene but pale, and something inside him stirred. The sensation of emptiness in his chest had grown, spreading through his limbs. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. His eyes darted around the room, his breath catching in his throat. Every shadow seemed to flicker with movement. Every creak of the floorboards felt like it was coming from something or someone else. Jacob stood up, his legs shaky beneath him. He needed air. He needed to clear his head. He needed to know that this was real. But when he stepped outside, the air felt thick and heavy, almost oppressive, like something was pressing down on him. It was hard to breathe, and the world seemed different, darker. The trees swayed unnaturally, and even the moon, bright and full just moments ago, was now hidden behind a veil of clouds. Panic surged in Jacob's chest. He turned quickly and ran back inside, locking the door behind him, as though that could keep whatever it was at bay. But as soon as the door shut, he felt something else. A coldness creeping up his spine, a sense of something wrong in the very walls of his house. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, growing taller, darker. Jacob's heart raced as his eyes flicked around, trying to find the source of the growing unease. But there was nothing there, except for the growing sense of dread. He couldn't explain it, but it felt like something was coming, something that had been waiting for him. He rushed back to Emily's side, his hands shaking as he checked her pulse. It was steady, stronger now, but something else was happening. Her eyes were closed, her breathing even, but her lips were twitching, as though she were muttering something. Jacob leaned in closer, his ears straining to hear, but the words were indistinct, muffled. He couldn't understand what she was saying. "Emily," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What are you saying?" But she didn't respond. Instead, her hand twitched, her fingers curling as if reaching for something. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he realized that her skin, once cold and clammy, was now warm to the touch. Warm in an unnatural way. And her breathing, it wasn't just stronger, it was deeper, almost as if she were being drawn into some kind of trance. Before he could react, Emily's eyes shot open, wide and glassy. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. But the look in her eyes was wrong. Her pupils were dilated, black as night, and there was a darkness in them that sent a chill straight to Jacob's bones. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Emily, are you?" But she didn't answer. Instead, she slowly turned her head to the side, her gaze fixed on something beyond him, something Jacob couldn't see. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She was staring at the shadows in the corner, the ones that seemed to grow longer with each passing second. Jacob felt his heart stop. His throat went dry. There was something there in the darkness, something waiting, something he couldn't explain. With a sudden, jerking motion, Emily's body sat upright, her back straight as if pulled by invisible strings. She twisted her neck with a disturbing crack, her head tilting unnaturally. Her hands reached out in front of her, her fingers twitching, as if beckoning something that wasn't there. Jacob backed away, his feet stumbling over the floorboards. His mind screamed at him to run, to get away, but his body wouldn't move. He couldn't look away. The horror in Emily's eyes, the unnatural way her body moved. It was as if she was no longer his daughter. She was someone else, something else entirely. "Emily, please, stop," Jacob whispered, his voice shaking with fear. And then the room went cold. The temperature dropped so quickly that Jacob could see his breath in the air. A thick mist began to form at the edges of the room, swirling around Emily like a fog. The shadows seemed to come alive, stretching toward her, as if drawn to the energy in the room. And that's when he heard it, whispers, faint but unmistakable, rising from the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a sinister hum. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't breathe. His head spun, and then the whispers stopped. Emily's head snapped to the side, and for the first time, her lips curled into a smile. But it wasn't her smile. It was something darker, something more sinister. "We are ready," she whispered, her voice not her own. "You can't run now." The room seemed to close in around Jacob, the air thick with an evil presence. The shadows stretched toward him, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble. He knew in that moment that he had made a terrible mistake. The price for saving Emily was far more than he had bargained for. Jacob's mind was spinning. The room felt colder by the second, and every corner seemed darker, as though the shadows were closing in on him. Emily's unnatural smile, the one that didn't belong to her, haunted him. His breath came in sharp gasps, his chest tightening with fear as he tried to make sense of what was happening. "Emily, what are you saying?" Jacob's voice cracked, barely louder than a whisper. "What do you mean, we are ready?" But Emily didn't respond. She only sat there, her body stiff and unmoving, her head tilted in an unnatural angle. Her fingers twitched in the air, her lips still curled into that eerie smile. It was as if she wasn't aware of him anymore. Not really. As if she was somewhere else entirely. Jacob's heart raced in his chest as he stepped back slowly, trying to put some distance between himself and the chilling presence that filled the room. Every part of him screamed to get away, to run, to hide, to find safety. But where could he go? What was happening to Emily? What had he unleashed? Suddenly, the house seemed to groan, the walls shuddering as though something inside it was waking up. Jacob's eyes darted around, his body tense with fear. The whispers that had been faint before were now growing louder, clearer, more distinct. And they weren't coming from Emily. They were coming from the very walls, the floor, the air around him. Whispers of voices, thousands of voices, all speaking in hushed tones, as if they were trying to communicate with him or maybe trying to warn him. He turned to face the door, his body trembling with panic. But as soon as he moved, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. He froze, his heart pounding in his ears. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in on him. The temperature continued to drop, and the mist around him grew thicker, curling around his legs like tendrils of smoke. And then, a low, growling noise rumbled from deep within the earth beneath the house. It sounded like something alive, something powerful, something ancient. Jacob's legs buckled, and he sank to the floor, his head spinning. His thoughts were a mess, and all he could do was stare at Emily, still sitting there with that unearthly smile plastered on her face. But something was wrong. Her smile, it wasn't a smile anymore. It was twisted, like something was trying to break through her skin, something that didn't belong. The mist grew thicker, swirling faster, and Jacob felt a cold pressure in his chest, as though invisible hands were squeezing the air out of his lungs. He gasped for breath, his vision blurring. Everything felt wrong. Suddenly, Emily's head snapped to the side, her eyes rolling back in her skull. A gasp escaped her lips, a sharp, painful sound that made Jacob's stomach turn. Her mouth opened wide, but no words came out. Instead, there was only a terrible, guttural sound, like something scraping its way out of the very depths of her soul. Jacob couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, too terrified to do anything but watch as Emily's body jerked and convulsed. Her skin stretched, pulled tight as though something was clawing its way to the surface. And then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. Emily's body went still, her eyes snapping open once more. But this time, they were different. They weren't her eyes anymore. They were dark and hollow, empty, like the eyes of a predator. For a moment, everything was silent. The whispers, the groaning of the house, the mist, all of it vanished in an instant. And in that silence, Jacob felt a shift in the air. He could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. "Daddy," Emily's voice was soft, almost sweet, but it wasn't Emily's voice. It was something else, something cold and distant. "Daddy," she said again, but this time, her voice had an edge to it, a sharpness that sent a chill down Jacob's spine. "I'm not the same anymore." Jacob's stomach churned as he stared at her, the realization hitting him like a wave. This wasn't his daughter anymore. Something else had taken her place. Something that had been waiting for the right moment to rise to the surface. No, this isn't you," Jacob whispered, his voice breaking. Emily's smile grew wider, her lips curling in a grotesque manner, exposing teeth that looked sharper than they should have been. "You didn't listen to me, did you?" she said, her voice now dripping with malice. "You wanted to save me, didn't you? But you didn't know the cost. You didn't know what you were giving up." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The weight of the words hit him hard. He had made a mistake. Terrible mistake. He had given up something, but what? What had he lost? And more importantly, what had he unleashed? "I've been waiting for this," Emily's voice continued, now a low, mocking tone. "You were so desperate, so willing to do anything. You thought Maeve could save me, but she didn't tell you the truth, did she?" Jacob felt his heart drop into his stomach. The room seemed to spin around him as the horrifying realization began to sink in. Maeve hadn't just healed Emily, she had made a bargain. And that bargain came with a price that Jacob hadn't fully understood until now. What did I do?" Jacob whispered, his voice filled with despair. Emily's head tilted to one side, her eyes now completely black, void of any humanity. "You freed me," she said with a wicked grin. "But you've also set me free. You've released something far darker than you could ever imagine." Suddenly, Emily's body jerked violently, and the shadows in the room seemed to writhe in response. The mist swirled around her, pulling her deeper into its cold embrace. Jacob felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized that Emily wasn't just being taken by something darker. She was becoming it. The whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of voices, all speaking in strange tongues. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Jacob could feel an unseen presence pressing in from every side. Before he could react, Emily's body lurched forward, her hands outstretched toward him. "It's time to pay, Daddy," she whispered, her voice a twisted version of the girl he had once known. And in that moment, Jacob realized that the nightmare was only just beginning. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as Emily's fingers stretched toward him, her once sweet face now twisted with something unholy. The room seemed to darken further, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. He couldn't look away, his body frozen in place, the terror creeping into every corner of his mind. "Daddy? It's time." Emily's voice echoed, still hauntingly familiar but far colder than he could ever have imagined. Her eyes, completely black now, glistened with a malice that sent shivers down his spine. Jacob's legs finally gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, his hands bracing himself as he tried to steady his trembling body. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that he feared it might burst. He opened his mouth to speak, to plead, but the words wouldn't come. The room seemed to close in on him, every breath heavier than the last. "Please, Emily. This isn't you." His voice was barely a whisper, choked with fear. Emily's smile deepened, her face contorting into something that could no longer be called human. Her features shifted, pulling tight against her skull, as if her very body was struggling to contain the dark force that now inhabited it. Her once innocent voice took on a cruel edge. "You should have never made that deal," she spat. "Now you will suffer the consequences." The whispers grew louder, surrounding him. They were no longer just faint voices in the walls. Now they filled his head, clamoring for attention. They spoke in riddles, in languages Jacob couldn't understand. Yet somehow he knew their meaning. They were warning him of the price he would have to pay for trying to save Emily. But it was too late. He had already made the bargain. He had already given his soul away. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and Jacob's vision blurred. He pressed his hands against his temples, trying to push back the pressure building inside his skull. The air felt colder still, as if the very house itself was alive and was sucking the warmth out of him. He looked up at Emily, her outstretched hand inches from his face. No, I didn't mean it," he pleaded, his voice cracking, his chest tight with terror. The twisted version of his daughter leaned closer, her breath cold against his skin. "It's too late for regrets, Daddy," she murmured. "The price has already been paid. You don't have a choice anymore." Jacob's pulse raced. His entire body trembled with fear. He could feel the weight of something heavy pressing down on him, suffocating him. The darkness in the room seemed to twist and writhe, the shadows lengthening as though they were alive. And beneath it all, he could feel a presence. Something ancient, something evil that was feeding off his fear. Emily's hand shot forward, grabbing Jacob's wrist with an unnatural force. Her grip was ice cold, like the touch of death itself. He tried to pull away, but it was as if her fingers were made of stone, unyielding and unbreakable. "No!" Jacob shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "I won't let you. I won't let it take me." But Emily only laughed, the sound hollow and mocking. "It already has, Daddy. You don't get to decide anymore. You're already part of the bargain." Jacob's mind spun. He thought of Maeve, the healer who had offered them the cure, the one who had promised salvation. But salvation had come with a price that now seemed too high to pay. He had been too blinded by hope, too desperate to save his daughter, to see the dark truth that lay beneath the surface. "Please," Jacob whispered again, tears streaming down his face. "Please help me. I'll do anything. Just take it back. Take it all back." But the room remained silent, the whispers fading into an ominous stillness. Emily's grip tightened, her smile widening as she looked down at him. "You already know the price," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You were warned. Now you must face the consequences." Jacob's heart raced as the shadows in the room began to shift, swirling around him like a living thing. The temperature continued to drop, and he could see his breath misting in the air. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, as if the house itself was alive, watching, waiting for something. Suddenly, Emily's grip loosened, and she took a step back, her head tilting to one side. Jacob gasped, confusion and terror mixing in his chest as he looked at her. What was happening? Why had she stopped? And then he saw it. The floor beneath him began to crack, the wood splitting open as if something was pushing up from below. The cracks spread, slowly at first, then faster, until the entire room seemed to be trembling. Jacob scrambled backward, but the floor continued to give way, revealing a dark abyss beneath him. It was as if the house itself was opening up, exposing the blackness that had been hidden for so long. "Emily!" Jacob cried, his voice raw and panicked. "What is this? What have I done?" But she just stood there, watching him with her hollow eyes, her smile never fading. "You opened the door, Daddy. Now you have to walk through it." A deafening roar filled the air, a sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. Jacob's heart skipped a beat, his chest tightening with fear as he stumbled back toward the door. But it was no use. The door was gone, swallowed by the expanding darkness. And then the ground beneath him gave way. Jacob screamed as he fell, tumbling into the black void below. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest as he fell, the air rushing past him like a violent wind. It felt like he was falling forever, plummeting into an endless black void. His stomach lurched, and his mind reeled, unable to grasp the enormity of what was happening. The world he had known, the world of daylight, of love and hope, seemed so far away now, as though it had never existed. The darkness around him was absolute, suffocating. He could no longer feel the floor beneath his feet, no longer hear the sounds of the house or his daughter's voice. All that was left was the cold, the deep, endless cold that chilled him to his very bones. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his chest, like a needle piercing his heart. He gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The darkness around him seemed to twist, warping and shifting, as if it had a life of its own. He could hear something, whispers, soft and insistent, drifting from all directions. Words he couldn't understand, but that made his skin crawl, sending shivers down his spine. And then the falling stopped. Jacob hit the ground with a sickening thud, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. He lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, unable to move. The pain was intense, radiating through his limbs and chest, but it was nothing compared to the terror that gripped him. He slowly pushed himself up, blinking against the darkness. The air was thick, heavy, like the inside of a tomb. He could barely see anything, the shadows swallowing up whatever light there was. His body trembled, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something primal, a fear that gnawed at the edges of his mind. He stood, his legs unsteady, and looked around. His eyes strained to make out any shapes, but there was nothing, just a vast, empty void. His breath caught in his throat as he realized the truth. He was alone. There was no way back. The world above, his house, his family was gone. This place, whatever it was all that remained. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Where are you?" The name escaped his lips like a prayer, but there was no answer. Only the silence of the void surrounded him, pressing in from all sides. He took a step forward, his heart pounding. His foot met solid ground, but the texture felt wrong, rough, uneven, almost alive beneath his feet. The whispers grew louder, like a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. It was deafening, disorienting. Jacob staggered back, his head spinning as the voices seemed to close in around him. They were mocking him, taunting him with their unintelligible words. He couldn't understand what they were saying, but it didn't matter. Their tone was enough. They were laughing at him. And then, Just as suddenly as they had started, the whispers stopped. A heavy silence filled the air, thick and oppressive. Jacob's breath caught in his throat, his chest tight with fear. He strained his ears, trying to hear anything that could tell him where he was, what was happening. But there was nothing. And then he felt it. Presence. Something moved in the darkness. Something that wasn't him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he turned, his body stiff with terror. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it, like a shadow creeping toward him, a dark shape in the blackness. "Who's there?" Jacob's voice shook, barely a whisper. "Show yourself." The silence stretched, longer than it should have been. Then, without warning, a cold, bone-chilling gust of wind swept through the void, hitting Jacob square in the chest. His clothes fluttered, his hair whipped around his face, but the wind felt unnatural, wrong. It wasn't a natural breeze. It was something alive, something hungry. Jacob's heart raced. He backed away, his eyes searching the darkness for any sign of movement. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let whatever was lurking in the shadows get closer. He had to find a way out. But as he took another step, the ground beneath his feet shifted. The floor cracked open with a deafening sound, splitting wide, and Jacob screamed as he fell again, his body tumbling into the unknown. When Jacob hit the ground again, he didn't feel the shock of impact this time. Instead, he landed softly, as if the very air had caught him. He lay there for a moment, disoriented, gasping for breath, his body shaking uncontrollably. The darkness was still around him, but it felt different now, thicker, heavier. He pushed himself to his feet, his eyes still straining to see. In the distance, a faint light flickered. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. A tiny glimmer of hope in the oppressive blackness. Jacob took a hesitant step toward the light, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His heart hammered in his chest as he moved closer, desperate for any sign of life, any sign that he wasn't alone. But with each step, the ground seemed to shift again, as if the darkness itself was playing tricks on him. The light grew brighter, and with it came a feeling of dread, a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that whatever lay ahead, it wasn't salvation. The whispers started again, this time louder than ever before. They surrounded him, cutting through the silence like a knife. Jacob clutched his head in his hands, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The voices were everywhere, their words growing clearer, more distinct. "No escape," one of the voices whispered. "You've made your choice." Jacob froze, his blood running cold. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was Emily's voice, but twisted, wrong, as though it had been warped by something dark and ancient. "Emily?" Jacob gasped, his voice cracking. "Is that you?" But the voice only laughed, a sound that made his skin crawl. "You can't save her," it taunted. "You've already lost." The light ahead flickered, and for a moment, it seemed as if it might disappear entirely. But then it burned brighter, hotter, and Jacob was drawn to it, his body moving forward without his permission. He had to know what lay ahead. He had to face whatever this was. But as he reached the light, something else appeared. A figure, standing in the center of it, cloaked in shadows. Jacob's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the figure. Maeve, the healer. But she wasn't the same as before. Her once warm eyes were now cold, distant, and her lips were twisted into a cruel smile. "You should never have come here," she whispered, her voice cold and empty. And just like that, Jacob knew. There was no escape. There was no way out. He had made his choice, and now he had to pay the price. The air around Jacob grew even colder as Maeve's figure loomed before him. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and compassion, were now empty, pools of blackness that swallowed any shred of hope Jacob might have clung to. The light behind her pulsed like a heartbeat, drawing him in despite the terror clawing at his chest. It wasn't just a light. It was a force, something far older and far more powerful than anything Jacob had ever known. Jacob's mind raced. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His heart was pounding in his chest, drowning out the rest of the world. He had been drawn here, into this place, this nightmare, and now he could feel the weight of his choices pressing down on him. "Maeve, what is this?" Jacob managed to choke out. His voice sounded thin, like a whisper lost in a storm. "What have you done?" Maeve's smile twisted, a mocking, cruel thing that didn't belong on her face. She stepped closer, and the ground beneath Jacob's feet seemed to shift, as though it was alive, moving with her. "You should have listened to the warnings," she said softly, her voice almost soothing, like a lullaby in the darkness. "But you didn't. You thought you could outsmart the price. You thought you could save her without paying the cost." Jacob shook his head, his mind spinning. "No, I didn't know. I didn't understand." "You never do," Maeve whispered, her eyes narrowing with a strange sadness. "But it's too late now. The price has been set. The deal was made. And now you must live with it." Jacob's hands trembled as he reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the light. The warmth was almost comforting, but it burned his skin, leaving behind an unbearable ache. The shadows in the corners of his vision seemed to creep forward, inching closer as if something was lurking, waiting. "Please," Jacob begged, his voice cracking. "Please, Maeve, tell me what I have to do. I'll do anything. Just don't let her suffer." Maeve's smile faded, replaced by a look of something colder, darker. She stepped back, gesturing toward the darkness behind her. "The price is simple," she said. "In exchange for her life, for the cure you so desperately sought, something precious must be given up. A soul, a life, a part of you. Something you cannot live without. A trade. A balance." Jacob's heart froze. He felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. A trade. Part of him. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "You can't. It's already been decided." Maeve cut him off sharply, her voice suddenly harsh, like the snap of a twig in the dead of night. "You made the choice when you asked for my help. Now you must pay the price. It's not negotiable. You can't escape it." A deep, gut-wrenching fear gripped Jacob's chest, suffocating him. He could feel it now, the weight of the decision, the gravity of what was at stake. It was no longer just Emily's life that hung in the balance. It was his own soul, his very existence. "But I can't." Jacob's voice trailed off, and the words died in his throat. He had to make a choice. But how could he? How could anyone choose between life and death? Between saving the one they loved and giving up everything they held dear? "Everything has a cost," Maeve said softly, almost pityingly. She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. "The world doesn't give without taking. Not without taking something far more precious than you realize." Jacob's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, his body trembling with the weight of the decision he knew he had to make. His mind raced, spinning in circles, each thought more frantic than the last. "I can't lose her. I can't lose her." "Maeve," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Please, tell me there's another way." But Maeve's eyes were cold, unyielding. She didn't answer, only watched him as he fell apart before her, the silence between them growing thick and suffocating. For a long moment, Jacob felt as if the entire world had collapsed in on him. He could hear nothing but the pounding of his own heart, a relentless rhythm that seemed to echo through the darkness. He had made his choice, but now the weight of it crushed him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could bear it. And then, through the fog of his mind, through the growing dread, a thought began to form. What if he could still find a way out? What if the price didn't have to be his soul? What if the thought hung there, fragile and fleeting, but it didn't fade completely? He had to try. He couldn't accept this. He couldn't let it end like this. Jacob's eyes flicked back to Maeve, his chest tight with the need to act. "I won't accept it," he said through gritted teeth, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "I'll find another way. I'll make it right. There has to be another way." Maeve's eyes narrowed, her lips twisting into something between a smile and a sneer. "You still don't understand, do you?" she said, her voice low and dangerous. "There is no other way. This is the price. This is how it must be." But Jacob didn't listen. The words faded from his mind, drowned out by the pounding of his heart. He wasn't going to give up. He couldn't. He loved Emily too much. He would find a way, no matter the cost. He turned and ran, stumbling through the dark, his mind consumed by a single thought. He had to get back. He had to save her, and he would do whatever it took. Jacob's heart raced as he stumbled through the darkness, his mind whirling with fear and desperation. His feet carried him, almost instinctively, away from Maeve and the nightmare that had engulfed him. The air around him was thick, pressing in on his chest, and the very ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, as if trying to pull him back. The whispers, they had started again. Faint at first, like a soft breeze in his ear, but they grew louder, closer, more insistent. They were like the voices of the past, of those who had come before him and made the same foolish decisions. They were warning him, condemning him, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't turn back. Emily, he had to save her. The path ahead was unclear, the darkness wrapping around him like a suffocating cloak. But in the distance, there was a faint flicker of light, like a beacon calling to him. Without thinking, he moved toward it, his steps quickening. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his chest, as if something inside him had been torn apart. He gasped, clutching his side, but the pain didn't stop. It spread, reaching deeper until it consumed him. The world around him began to spin, his vision blurring as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath. The pain was unbearable, but he didn't have time for this. He had to get back to Emily. He couldn't lose her. "Please," he whispered, his voice strained. "I'll do anything. Please just let me make it right." The darkness around him seemed to listen, and for a brief moment, everything was still. The whispers faded, the pain subsided, and the ground beneath him stilled. He felt a presence. It was cold, yet familiar, like the touch of death itself. "Maeve," her voice echoed in his mind, like a soft murmur on the wind. "You can't run from it, Jacob. The price has already been paid. There is no turning back now." He gritted his teeth, fighting against the fear that threatened to consume him. "I don't care. I won't accept it." The light ahead grew brighter, blinding him. He pushed through the pain, through the darkness, towards Emily. The light wasn't just a beacon, it was his last hope. With every step, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. His mind was a maelstrom of confusion, each thought clashing with the next. He couldn't focus. He couldn't think. He had to act. And then he saw it. The hill. The hollow hill, just as he remembered it, only now it was different. There was no eerie calm, no unsettling quiet. The hill was alive with movement, with shadows shifting in and out of existence. The air around it was thick with a sense of dread, as though something dark and ancient was awakening. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the place where everything had started and where it would end. The cure, the price, his soul. He didn't want to do it. He didn't want to face the truth. But there was no other way. Maeve had made sure of that. With trembling hands, he stepped forward. The hill loomed before him, a monstrous silhouette against the dark sky. The whispers grew louder, filling his ears, drowning out all other sound. They were calling to him, begging him to listen. Jacob, a voice called, soft and familiar. It was Emily's voice. His heart skipped a beat. He spun around, but no one was there. He was alone, standing at the foot of the hill, the wind howling around him like a beast in the night. "Emily," he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. The hill beckoned him. The truth was there, buried beneath the earth, waiting to be uncovered. He had no choice but to face it. With a deep breath, Jacob stepped forward, his body shaking as he descended into the hollow, the very air growing colder with each step. The shadows stretched long and twisted, as though reaching for him. His feet felt heavy, like lead, but he forced himself to move, one step at a time, deeper into the heart of the hill. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence, sharp and clear. "You made your choice, Jacob." He froze, his blood running cold. Maeve, she was here, in the darkness with him, her presence looming over him like a shadow. "You can't save her," Maeve whispered, her voice like ice against his skin. "You never could. Not without paying the price." "No," Jacob breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "I can still do this. I can make it right." The darkness around him shifted, and for a moment he saw her, Emily, standing at the far end of the hollow. She looked just as she had before the illness, her face pale but beautiful, her eyes wide with fear. "Emily," he called, rushing toward her. "Emily, please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant for this." But as he neared her, she faded, disappearing into the darkness, leaving him standing alone once again. "No!" Jacob cried out, his voice breaking. "I won't let you take her. I'll do whatever it takes." A cold laugh echoed through the hollow, and the earth beneath Jacob's feet trembled. The shadows seemed to twist, reaching for him, pulling him down. "You've already given enough," Maeve said, her voice cold and distant. "Now, it's time to claim what is yours." Jacob stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what Maeve meant, but he felt the cold grip of fear tighten around his throat. He had made a deal. He had asked for a cure, but now, standing here, he realized that he had never truly understood the consequences. "Emily, the price." He looked down at his hands, feeling something dark and heavy stirring deep inside him. He had done this. He had made this choice. Now it was time to face the consequences. And as the darkness closed in around him, he realized that there was no escape. There was no way out. The price had been paid, and there was no turning back.